And
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for inviting me along, Sarah and Nicole. I'm really grateful. My name's Joanna Stanbridge, educational psychologist in Cambridgeshire. I'm a senior, but I don't like being called senior because it makes me feel old, so I go by senorita. I'm not sure that helps my credibility, but it makes me feel better. So I've worked with Cambridgeshire forever. I'm fairly institutionalised, but fairly recently I had the opportunity to work with the team at EdPsychEd, just phenomenal, Richard and Jen, to put together some CPD around literacy for EPs. So I'm going to talk to you about why, from my point of view, literacy difficulties are as much of a social justice issue as any other that we work in as educational psychologists. I think sometimes literacy difficulties for EP, I think they're sort of like the boring cousin that you don't want to get stuck with at a party, aren't they? Sort of think, oh, that's not real psychology. But I'd like to try to convince you, if I can, that actually it's brilliant psychology and it's so important. So I hope the starfish analogy will become clear as we go through. So just to start off with, I wanted to think about what it means to be literate, because unless we think about that, it's hard to really focus on why we're doing what we're doing when we're trying to teach children to read or write. So in a book called Listening to Stephen Reed, Hall talks about different perspectives on literacy. She talks about a psycholinguistic perspective, which is a perspective that to be literate is to be able to take meaning from text. So roughly about comprehension, building situation models of what we're reading, linking what we're reading with our existing representations of the world. There's a cognitive perspective on literacy, and we'll be really familiar with that. That's kind of what the basis of most of the reading framework is about. And it's about being able to identify what words are. So we're familiar with that through decoding. So those two areas, psycholinguistic perspectives and cognitive perspectives, are probably things that we think about a lot as EPs and what teachers would think about a lot. But there are two other perspectives which are really important and I think relate to our role as psychologists and our unique contribution. So one perspective is a social cultural perspective on literacy, where you'd be considering the role of literacy in a given context. So it might be a family context, it might be a school context, it might be a wider societal context. And this is important because this often links to what people refer to as stigma that they experience when they struggle with reading or writing. So we know that lots of children and young people, actually adults with literacy difficulties, will do their best to mask it, and it can be exhausting. And there's a lot of research which has suggested that that's partly because it's really embarrassing struggling with reading and writing in a culture in which those skills are so highly prized and associated with notions of intelligence and worth. So we'll come back to that at the end. But what I really want to focus on today is a socio-political perspective on literacy, where being literate can be associated with notions of equity and power. And to kind of really demonstrate that, I just wanted to read you this quote by Yusuf Kassam, who said, to be literate is to become liberated from the constraints of dependency. To be literate is to gain a voice and to participate meaningfully and assertively in decisions that affect one's life. To be literate is to gain self-confidence. To be literate is to become self-assertive. To be literate is to become politically conscious and critically aware and to demystify social reality. Literacy enables people to read their own world and to write their own history. Literacy makes people aware of their basic human rights and enables them to fight for and protect their rights. Literacy enables people to have a greater degree of control over their own lives. Literacy helps people to become self-reliant and resist exploitation and oppression. Literacy provides access to written knowledge, and knowledge empower. In a nutshell, literacy empowers. So you might be thinking, the eagle-eyed among you might have been thinking that was written in 1989. So just for a bit of context, the Bangles were at #1 with Eternal Flame in 1989. And it was a totally different time. We were in the dying months of an extended Tory government. The country was about to go into recession. Everyone was on strike, so totally different time. But also, you might be saying, well, we know that Yusuf Kassan was talking about international development. And so those are fair points. But I'd like to argue that that quote is as relevant in the UK in 2023 as it was referring to international development in 1989. And to make that point, I'm going to share with you a sort of a life path. I'm not very good at whizzy IT stuff, so this is done using some clip art and some arrows. But it's really to make the point that we are very focused on children with literacy difficulties, but we spend hopefully a lot longer being adults than we do children. So we take the average life expectancy in the UK, it's 80. So about the first quarter of that is spent in compulsory education. And again, sort of half of that again is sort of school age, where I'm not sure about you, but even though I work technically 0 to 25, probably 5 to 16 is where I do the majority of my work. So I want to think about what happens to adults who struggle with literacy, because we would be unwise to just think about literacy difficulties being associated with education. In fact, the impacts can reach far wider. So there are well-known correlations between literacy difficulties and health difficulties. Literacy difficulties can correlate with the likelihood of people rating their health as very poor. And there's evidence that those with significant literacy difficulties are 3 times more likely to have their daily activities limited by poor health. In fact, the correlation between literacy difficulties and health difficulties is so alarming that Public Health England have called for the development of a discipline called health literacy, which explicitly looks at and addresses the impact of literacy difficulties on people's ability to read and process health advice and information, including dealing with existing health conditions. And also for safe management of health conditions. There's evidence that those with significant literacy difficulties are up to 18 times less likely to be able to identify and take medications as prescribed. And it's terrifying if you think about it. And of course, that's going to include adults with children who are giving medication to children. And you might be forgiven now for thinking, well, we can't be talking about that many people, but just you wait and see. So literacy, the impacts of literacy difficulties can extend far beyond just not getting good GCSEs or not going to the university of your choice. We know that they can impact on health. We also know that the likelihood of involvement with the criminal justice system is increased for those who have literacy difficulties. So sometimes it's bandied around that half of offenders in custody have literacy levels which are very low, but actually I've been schooled on that and saying it's probably about a third of offenders. Either way, it's much higher than in the general population. And no one thinks that literacy difficulties are a causal factor in the likelihood of criminal offending behaviour. But what is thought is that that literacy difficulties exacerbate existing risk factors for involvement in criminal justice. So low attainment, negative experience of school, exclusion, non-attendance, and of course, links with unemployment. So this quote by Rice and Brooks I find really powerful. When they looked at literacy instruction in prisons, they concluded, for the time being, reading instruction in prisons can be justified not by its potential for reducing reoffending, but by its potential for restoring to society those people who are excluded from full citizenship because they have yet to attain functional literacy. And I just want to leave that hanging there, because again, literacy is core to our work if we are trying to work on level playing fields and addressing endemic social justice issues, restoring to full excluded from full citizenship. I think that's really powerful. And again, in terms of thinking, well, what's that got to do with me and my role? I think any of us who work with specialist SEMH provisions or alternative provisions, I think there's a really clear link in terms of what we could be doing to support literacy in those settings. So we know that literacy difficulties can be associated with health difficulties, with crime, and then of course inevitably literacy difficulties are highly associated with poverty. And it's thought actually that's bidirectional. So low literacy levels are a key driver of poverty and inequality in the UK, as well as often a consequence. We know that the proportion of adults with significant literacy difficulties isn't evenly distributed. So those in the lowest income areas are much more likely to struggle with literacy. It's that a quarter of adults in the lowest income areas are likely to have very low literacy levels. And again, I'd just like you to take a minute for that to sink in. 1/4 of adults with very low literacy levels. So all of the things that we've been talking about up to now are not kind of confined to a small population. We are all extraordinarily likely to be working with adults with significant literacy difficulties and not to know about it. And that's compared to about 5% of adults in the highest income areas of the UK. We know that homelessness is higher amongst adults with literacy difficulties, more so for women than men. I'm not sure why that is, but we do know that the risk increases with the severity of literacy difficulties. There is a considerable inequality in the UK between the literacy levels of the highest and lowest earners. So we know that those with the discrepancy in the literacy levels between those who earn the most and the least in the UK is extraordinarily high. The youngest generation of adults in the UK is only matching rather than surpassing the literacy levels of the oldest generation. So I don't think there's any lack of initiative and motivation to support literacy development in schools, but I think we've got evidence that it's not working at the moment. And we know that children growing up in a family with low income are themselves more likely to live in poverty, and children who grow up with parents with low literacy skills are more likely to experience literacy difficulties. And in part, this may be related to families' access to resources and also time to engage in reading activities as well. So I don't know if you saw this headline over the summer saying 1 in 5 children in England don't own any books of their own. I think unless you've worked with families or experienced it yourself, that's really hard to get your head around. But I'm not sure that the curriculum always takes that into account. So I think, again, we can bring that level of context and understanding about what's going on. So if we think about what this means for end of school outcomes, in terms of end of GCSEs, it's really hard to get hold of GCSE English results, and the government tends to combine GCSE English and maths results together. So last year, half of children and young people didn't pass maths and English GCSE. So that's fairly worrying. Where I have managed to find data just for English GCSE, it was 39%, but that was quoted in something like Schools Week. I don't know how reliable that number was. What is consistent year on year is that the proportion of children who pass English Maths GCSEs is mediated by poverty. So the proportion of children not passing English and Maths jumps considerably when you look at children, look at social economic factors. Children from eligible for free school meals, only 30% of them, not quite 30%, pass English and Maths GCSE. And we know that there are other factors. We know that from data from last year, and it was similar in the years preceding, children from mixed and Black Caribbean children were not awarded pass grades in English and Maths at the same rate as children from other ethnicities, and more so for Irish Traveller and Gypsy Roma children. So we know that there are endemic inequalities in awarding of literacy and maths levels together. And again, this is probably not new. In fact, there's a headline from the summer just gone saying there's been no change in the attainment gap in England for 20 years. So this is long term. This isn't a new phenomenon. And if we go down now to the end of Key Stage 2, when children are 11 during that school year, you can see here reading and writing, the proportion of children, the percentage of children achieving pre-specified end of Key Stage 2 levels in reading and writing from 2010 through to 2022, with the exception of the COVID years. They're not included there. And as you can see, things seem to be kind of moving forward up to about 2015. In 2016, there's a massive dip, and that we think may be related to a change in SATS papers, but you can see it's remained consistently fairly low since. And just to say this, in the bit in the shaded boxes would be children who'd be in Key Stage in year 6 who would have done the phonics screening check. So we can see that even with the phonics screening check in place, there's still a concerning proportion of children not achieving those levels. And I think it would be fair to say, who decides what pre-specified levels are for Key Stage 2 reading and writing? I think that would be a fair question. You know, how good a measure are they of children's skills? I think, you know, we could definitely talk about that. But I think regardless, what we can see is that there are lots of children not achieving what the government has set out that they expect is a reasonable level of literacy at 11. So then if we look specifically at last year, we can see again that a quarter of children didn't pass Key Stage 2 reading outcomes and 31% for writing. But again, the point I wanted to make is that's mediated by poverty across all ethnic groups. So you're far less likely to pass or achieve those pre-specified levels for reading and writing at 11 if your family is eligible for free school meals. So one of the things that comes up a lot, I spend a lot of time talking about about this, you might be able to tell, so it's a bit of a passion, is that prevalence rates for literacy difficulties or dyslexia, they vary massively according to who you're talking about. So some people say, oh, well, we're only really talking about 3% of the population, and that estimate, you know, prevalence rates go up to 20%. Now, we in Cambridgeshire, we take the highest prevalence rate because we want to catch as many as possible, if not all children with literacy difficulties, as early as possible. And I think looking at these figures, I think it's fair to say that 20% isn't likely to be an underestimate for people who are struggling with literacy. We don't need to get involved now in why they're struggling. What we know is they are, and we need a system that does something about it. So you may be thinking, what's all this got to do with EPs? Well, one of the things that comes up a lot, and I think people sort of dread talking to me about literacy because of my sort of an enthusiasm for it, but quite often people say, oh, that's really great, Joanna, that you're into this, and I'm so glad you're doing it, because, you know, really, I'm not very confident in literacy. It's not really my thing. And I think, what, excuse me, baking powder, how can literacy not be your thing? We can't say autism's not my thing. We can't say trauma, it's not my thing. Literacy has to be our thing as EPs. It has to be part of what we do. So one of the things that I would like, and my poor team must be sick of me, but I say build literacy into every piece of casework that you do, for the reasons that we've just spoken about. It matters so much. And that doesn't mean like do a Wyatt for everyone that you work with, but just mention literacy, you know, even if it's just to say, I've asked the question and I'm not aware of any literacy difficulties, you know, all the way through to more detailed assessments or using assessment information that schools got. I think one thing that we can do is raise the profile of literacy and make sure that we're keeping it at the top of our agenda, because, as I said, it matters. Now, I spent quite a lot of time thinking about why it is that EPs often say to me they're not confident with literacy difficulties, and school staff as well. There's lots of evidence about school staff's confident with literacy, and there's kind of one of the conclusions I've come to is the kind of the power of the D words, dyslexia diagnosis. I don't think it's the word dyslexia on its own. I think it's the word diagnosis that comes with it that seems to throw people into this panic. So earlier on in my career, not so much now, because I think I sort of we've kind of moved on from this little bit in Cambridgeshire, but for a long time you'd be involved with someone with literacy difficulties. The school would say, oh, the child's struggling with literacy. And then everyone starts saying, oh, maybe they've got dyslexia. Maybe we need to have an assessment. Do we need a dyslexia assessment? Maybe they need a dyslexia diagnosis. And you'd be saying, but well, you know that they're struggling with that literacy. I'm not sure this diagnosis is going to make any difference, because all the evidence, the massive weight of evidence indicates that the term dyslexia means difficulties with accurate and or fluent reading and or spelling at the word level. It doesn't tell us anything about causality. It doesn't tell us anything about the intervention. It doesn't tell us anything about severity. We haven't yet worked out how you would identify someone as dyslexic as opposed to struggling with reading or writing at the word level for other reasons. And I can't emphasize enough, I'm not in any way diminishing the experience of those whose needs have been identified as dyslexic. Absolutely not. I can't imagine how excruciating it must be to struggle with literacy and go to school every day and have to demonstrate what you know through writing and have all your all the information presented to you, and you have to read it and you struggle with that. So I'm not diminishing, but what I'm saying is actually that the pursuit of diagnosis isn't the thing that's going to make a difference. It's almost like all the energy has gone into this argument here, or this pursuit of a diagnosis, where actually in terms of what you do, it won't change things. It might change how people feel about their needs and how they identify with their needs, and that's something different. I think we can think sensitively about how to address, but the diagnosis bit, I think, has kind of got us stumped. So it reminds me of a poem by Lewis Carroll called The Hunting of the Snark, or An Agony in 8 Fits is the subtitle. He spends 100 and something stanzas describing this band of explorers looking for a mythical creature called a snark, and they looked high and low and they thought they'd found it, and in the very last stanza they discovered that the snark was actually an animal they already knew, a boojum. So in the midst of the world, he was trying to say, in the midst of his laughter and glee, he had softly and suddenly vanished away, for the snark was a boojum, you see. I quite like that, because it makes you think, okay, you can spend all this energy looking to distinguish something you know is already right under your nose. You know someone's struggling. Let's think about what we do about it. So you may be saying, that's all very well, but Joanna, but surely you need dyslexia diagnosis for things like exam concessions, additional resources, secondary transfer. How will the secondaries know to address needs, to acknowledge or have an affirming label? Well, no. Exam access arrangements are needs-led and carried out by settings. They categorically do not, according to the JCQ and in fact to the British Dyslexia Association, they do not require a diagnosis of dyslexia. Allocation of resources according to the Code of Practice, in fact, the English Code of Practice, but also the Welsh, Northern Irish and Scottish equivalents, none of them requires a diagnosis of dyslexia, none of them for resource allocations. Secondary schools are as bound by the same Code of Practice as primary schools. So if secondary schools aren't acknowledging these because there's not a diagnosis of dyslexia, that's an issue then of equity that we need to challenge them on. And lastly, you shouldn't need a label for needs to be acknowledged. People can tell you're struggling, but if it is important to people, that should be available via identifying needs, not just formal diagnosis. So when we use the term dyslexia, we say you can use it descriptively to mean difficulties at the word level. Absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be more mythical than that. But Joanna, surely just identification rather than diagnosis, doesn't that diminish the importance of supporting children with literacy difficulty, dyslexia? You're just kind of saying it doesn't matter. Not at all. I couldn't emphasize more how much it matters. But what identification of needs rather than diagnosis does means that you can identify the needs of many more, if not all, children with literacy difficulties. We know there's evidence of social economic status and a factor in the likelihood of a dyslexia label. From a social justice point of view, if we rely on a formal diagnosis to take needs seriously, we're going to perpetuate the very inequality that we've just been talking about. We must have a system where we can identify needs and take them as seriously as those who've been diagnosed. This is one I hear often. If local authorities just got off their bums and provided diagnoses, we wouldn't have a situation where parents were having to seek out private assessment. Well, not really. First of all, you don't need a diagnosis to identify needs, work out what to do about them, or provide support under any circumstance. It's not necessary educationally. Even if it was, which it's not, with a prevalence rate of 20% in Cambridgeshire, we're talking 17,000 children, young people with some levels of dyslexia or literacy difficulties, whatever you want to call it. Nationally, we're talking about 1.8 million. We need a system in which all children's literacy needs can be identified and addressed. And this kind of comes back to the point of the starfish. The starfish story, I'm not sure if you are aware of it. There's a story about a young person walking along the beach, picking up starfish one at a time and throwing them back into the sea. And the adult with them says to them, "Why are you doing that?" And the boy says, "I need to save them." and the person with them, the adult, says you can't possibly save all of them, and the young person says, oh, but I can save that one. Now, I think that is hugely commendable and brilliant, that you'd want to try and support as many people as you can, but we can't throw all the starfish back into the sea one by one. That's an individual diagnosis model. We've got them washing up in droves. What we need, I like the idea of a kind of coastal shelf mechanism which stops them washing up in the first place. And that's the analogy of the starfish, that actually what we can do as educational psychologists is help build those systemic frameworks, those coastal shelf mechanisms, to stop the starfish getting washed up, to stop children getting to a point where their literacy difficulties are entrenched, or have a structure for what to do if they are. You might be saying, well, if that's the case, why do people go on about diagnosis so much? And it's because everywhere you look, it's there. So if you do a quick Google, the NHS website comes up. The earlier a child with dyslexia is diagnosed, the more effective educational interventions are likely to be. Not so. The earlier a child with literacy difficulties is identified, the more effective interventions are likely to be. That's true, but the diagnosis has got naff all to do with it. And again, down the road from me in Cambridge, there's a company which proclaims, once dyslexia is diagnosed, you can identify your needs and take control, in that voice. But that's not the case. Once your literacy difficulties are identified, you can identify needs and take control. But this narrative diagnosis is really ingrained. So that it is quite interesting. Psychologist Simblett did her thesis on representations of dyslexia in the media, and she was looking at what words co-located with dyslexia, so what words were next to dyslexia in newspaper reports, and she found that the terms diagnosed and undiagnosed were in the majority of cases situated next to the word dyslexia in newspapers. So it's in the public narrative that identified dyslexia is synonymous with diagnosis. And then here we are saying, no, you don't need to do that. Enter Hancock, who sort of proclaims that he's going to have every single child identified with dyslexia by the time they go to secondary school. You're like, come on, Matt. Like, I am all for raising the profile of literacy difficulties and addressing them, as I hope you can see. But I've got a few questions here. One, what's diagnosing them going to do that's different to implementing something that's effective for them? Two, why are you waiting till they're at the end of primary school? So there's a number of different things. I think we have to be aware of this, because what we don't want to do is have arguments with people about whether or not we should use the word dyslexia or not. But what we do want to do is say we need to have systems which work, and we've got a clear role in that. So you might have noticed I'm getting a bit worked up here, and you might think, why do you care so much? Because it matters, because reliance on dyslexia diagnosis perpetuates the inequality we've been talking about. We know that the SEND is much more represented in disadvantaged groups, but the likelihood of a SEND label is much less likely in disadvantaged groups. There's been seen in the States that the likelihood of a dyslexia label is predicted by social economic status, even though the likelihood of literacy difficulties is predicted in the opposite direction by social economic status. And actually recently in the UK, we know that in the Millennium Cohort Study, which was looking at a massive cohort of children born over the period of the millennium, the likelihood that children would have a dyslexia label was predicted by income and class. So Knight and Quick, who carried out that study, concluded it could be seen as a contributing factor in widening the education gap between higher and low social economic classes. And I'm not sure what it's like in your local authority, but where I work, and I'm be all right to say this, it's published in a Guardian article, so I can't get fired for it. The children who are funded to attend independent specialist educational provision for dyslexia in Cambridgeshire all come from the most advantaged areas of the county, or certainly did when the data was collated in 2019. So it really matters. At this point, I just want to say, I don't think it would be helpful to blame parents for this. I think I'm a parent. I would do anything that I thought my children needed to help them. So I don't think I think it's really important that we're not parent blaming, but I do think we need to expose and reform a system which allows this sort of inequality to perpetuate. So it's not about taking away support for those people who have already got it. It's about making sure that's available to everyone. So what's that got to do with us? Well, we can refuse to be sidetracked. We can say, I'm not having a discussion about whether or not this child should be called dyslexic or not. Like, just not talking about that. I'm not interested. What I'm going to talk about is how to identify needs and what to do about it. I think we can be mindful of how to not inadvertently perpetuate the difficulty. So sometimes I think we sort of panic a bit and say things like, oh, signs of dyslexia or dyslexic tendencies, just to sidestep it. But I think what that can do is to give a sense that there's still something to find out, or they might have dyslexia. So I think we could just be mindful not to do that. And we can keep our focus on working towards systems that work for everyone. The other thing I think we can bring in, which isn't represented enough, is thinking about preparation for adulthood frameworks and thinking about what it means to be literate for the young children, young people who we're working with, what they need in order to be access literacy in their society and in their world and what's important to them. So we can shift the paradigm. We can move from talking about literacy difficulties or dyslexia, shift it from a medical issue to an educational issue. Doesn't diminish how serious and important it is, doesn't diminish the fact that there are identified brain areas associated with literacy difficulties, but just to say the solution to them at present isn't medical. We don't know how to operationalize that. We do know how to operationalize educational support. We can move the conversation on about thinking about within-person difficulties, to looking at people in context, which I know that's what you do. It's your bread and butter, of course, as EPs. We can stop talking about diagnosis and we can talk about identification of need. Now, I don't think that means we need to argue about whether or not we call someone dyslexic or not. It's almost, that's not a helpful argument once they've already got that label associated with them. But we can stop talking about a diagnosis of dyslexia. As I say, we can move from individual diagnostic models, one starfish at a time, to systemic frameworks, coastal mechanisms to support all the starfish. So we can do that by making literacy everybody's business, by banging on about it relentlessly. And I think one of the things we're good at is that sort of endless optimism and hope that things can change. We're really good at facilitating systemic change. We're trained for it and we're good at it. We're necessary irritants. I think we're often forgiven for irritating systems that aren't working. We're out there in schools. We've got great opportunities to do this, but we're in there, we're working often as parts of larger organizations. And it matters. It cuts to the heart of the values that we all hold dear: inclusion, participation, self-determination, empowerment, and social justice. You might be thinking, now what does that look like? And I have no idea how much time I've got left, so I'm just going to talk really fast now. There's amazing examples of systems around the UK. The work that Sarah Crawford and Joe Ward have done up in Staffordshire and Warwickshire is amazing. And if you get the chance, please book in to see some of the work they do. Essex has got the most fantastic literacy offer. It's really solid, and they've got this brilliant training program as well. We've got literacy groups around the UK. I'm a part of one set up by an amazing EP from Portsmouth, who she set up, Victoria Parker. She set up this regular literacy group for interested in EPs. Things are moving. But I want to talk to you about what we're doing in Cambridgeshire. We use what's called a response to intervention framework. And this is what it looks like. In the form of a triangle, which we all know is the most reliable of the shapes. But it's actually very simple, but it is the most evidence-based systemic framework for responding to learning difficulties. So it's an example of a multi-tiered system of support. I always forget what the acronym stands for. But the key to it is that there's 3 levels. So at tier 1, we've got relevant universal screening. That doesn't mean we stick everyone in front of a dyslexia screener. What that means is we're screening children for experiencing actual or risk of literacy difficulties. And we talk to schools about using existing information, kind of trash to treasure, like what information have you got from early years foundation stage? What information have you got from the phonics screening check? What key stage information have you got? What other information have you got? So we talk about screening for everyone, and where necessary, putting in kind of more wider whole school or cohort screening for literacy difficulties. The point of that, and I think one of the bits which is most important about that, is we're getting rid of this idea of a wait to fail model, or that absolute nonsense that one can't identify dyslexia till a child is 7. Nonsense. You can identify literacy difficulties or the risk of them from reception. You can do something about it. So tier 1 talks about high quality teaching, which I, if I'm honest, haven't tended to talk about much because I have imposter syndrome. I haven't had my own class since 2009. And I wonder sometimes whether I'm the right person to talk about high quality teaching, but there are principles that I think we could definitely share with schools. The other key part of this tier 1 is accessible classrooms. That's sometimes known as dyslexia friendly classrooms. Those are just a series of really low level, small tweaks which make it easier for children with literacy difficulties to access what's going on in the classroom. We talk about emotional well-being and emotional responses to learning to being the most important one there, because when we've interviewed children and young people with literacy difficulties, that's what comes up. They also talk about, when we've said to them, what helped you at school? They never talk about the intervention. They always talked about the little things that their teachers and teaching assistants in their classes did to make them feel acknowledged and make things a bit easier for them. So we talk about that for everyone, and we've got a massive drive at the moment and training on that as kind of the most important thing that you could probably do, because even as you get to tier 2, where you've been monitoring progress, children aren't making progress, you need to do something, you need to put in a intervention. The intervention isn't going to operate in a vacuum. So we talk about tier 1 being so important. At tier 2, we're talking to schools a lot about targeting interventions. So we're saying, you know, if the struggle is with fluency, you need an intervention which is going to address that. If it's phonic knowledge, you need an intervention to address that. If it's applying phonic knowledge so that you can work out what words are, you need an intervention for that. If it's comprehension, if it's spelling, if it's writing composition, if it's handwriting. So again, we're trying to move away from the sense that the way you might hear schools say occasionally, this is our literacy intervention. And I can't emphasize that schools are by and large doing more than is humanly possible with not enough time and not enough resources. But they tend to be very positive about this because it's doable, and often they're using things which are already available. We're just helping them to streamline them. And then for children who aren't making progress, we talk about more bespoke assessment to personalised intervention, but that's not a dyslexia assessment, and there's not a secret stash of dyslexia intervention. Sorry, we've got hidden up our sleeves. It's just saying at this level we might need to personalise what's going on. So we're doing that. We're giving away psychologies. We're supporting schools. We're developing the workforce. School staff are so often exceptionally skilled, but have lost so much confidence, as identified by Gibbs and Elliott. And actually, there's very little that school staff are not trained to do. What we can do is support them to do that. This is one thing that's coming up a lot at the moment, is how that all fits with the reading framework. So Ofsted are kind of inspecting to the DFE's reading framework, which expects that there's one approach to teaching literacy, even for those learners who are struggling, and that's using systematic synthetic phonics, ideally through a validated program. That will be the main approach to teaching phonics for the purposes of word reading. So what we say to our schools is, using the response to intervention framework to support literacy difficulties, it's not contradicting that. We're not saying don't use those programs. We're not saying that it's not really important that the teaching of systematic synthetic phonics isn't solid. You'd be checking you're doing it properly. What we are saying is there are children who are not making progress even with that in place. And what we can't afford to do is just say, no, that's the best way, it's the only way. So we're not arguing about a general approach to teaching reading. That's a separate argument, it's beyond my world. But where we can come in is say, let's look at the evidence base. Let's look at saying, if this child isn't making progress, what's going on? And what can we do about it? So we talk to schools about using RTI as a decision-making framework for supporting those decisions. And if anybody questions them about why they might be teaching in a different way, they'll be able to say, because we did this, we checked this, the child wasn't making progress, so we've done this for this reason. We'll monitor whether that works. And it's much more robust. So you can, it might be that there are the things they're doing, for example, maybe they're teaching letter sound knowledge in a different way. Maybe it's still teaching synthetic phonics, but maybe emphasizing direct instruction, speeded practice, and cumulative review, using things like a precision teaching framework. Maybe, for some children, we're saying for these ones, we might emphasize sight vocabulary for good reasons, maybe associated with their emotional responses to learning or whatever else it is. That doesn't mean that you would never come back to decoding skills, because sometimes that's mischaracterized as kind of saying, oh, you can't teach children every word in the English language. Like, no one in their right mind would be suggesting that. But there may be for some children that at certain points, building a sight vocabulary may be helpful for them. There might be alternative systematic phonics approaches. So often synthetic phonics, so letter sound skills and blending them, is characterized as the only alternative to whole word teaching. But actually, there's a million things in between. Phonics just means using the sounds of language to work out what it says. So there are different things you can look at. There's all sorts of different levels in between. There's syllabification, there's onset rhyme, there's morphology, there's different things that you could do. And we're not saying do that unless children aren't making progress with what's going on. And then, of course, the reading framework is less keen on decodable books, but we could be saying to schools, listen, like there is a role for decodable books sometimes, because we need children to have stronger vocabularies and develop their comprehension skills. If they can only develop comprehension skills in text they can read, and that text is really simple, they could end up with comprehension difficulties because they never had the chance to apply their skills. So again, I don't think we have to be in battle with a DFE about this. I think we can look at what they're saying. We can say yes, and. So just to kind of tell you finally about how we've implemented this, I'll just sort of share a study we've done in a school in Cambridgeshire. So we developed what we called a literacy pathway for the school. So we looked at what screening information they already had, and they had to use something from their academy chain particular approach. I don't know that it's what I would have chosen, but it was there. So we decided to use the information from it. I think that's key, is it was working with what you've got and making the best of it. Excuse me. And then we looked at how you'd identify who was struggling, who was at risk of struggling with their word reading, fluency, comprehension, spelling, writing, etc. And then working out what to do about it, who needed to sit in that top tier of being monitored, making sure accessible classrooms were in place, and loads of workforce development, identifying what interventions they had, where they needed more interventions. So they've got the pathway they've developed. One thing that we did with that was once a term, I'd go in for 45 minutes and teachers could come or TAs could come and drop in and talk to me about children they're a bit stuck with. Easiest 45 minutes of my life, like a real joy to be able to problem solve, quick fire problem solve. And they said they found that really useful. So we gave them, just to see whether or not this was having an impact, we gave them a teacher self-efficacy scale for literacy. And we find the post scores were considerably higher. I did run a statistical analysis on them. We just published this, and one of the reviewers suggested the sample size was too small for it to be reliable. So we'll just stick with it was considerably higher than pre-measure. So teacher confidence increased, and when we interviewed them, they shared things like feeling empowered to teach in the way children need. So things like it's empowering for everybody. The staff talked about feeling more confident using best practice for children with SEND, including things like repetition, direct instructions, so that stuff that had come up in accessible classrooms. They found the accessible classroom stuff very effective, which was interesting because sometimes when you talk about it in consultation, it's almost dismissed as fobbing off the proper work, just kind of putting in this low level stuff. But they talked about it being really helpful. Just little things like the increased use of assistive technology. One said he's produced more in a few sessions than all year. He's enthusiastic now. And they talked about things like how easy it was to embed visual cues, talked about wider reaching impact, so individual children's progress, but also emotional responses to literacy and confidence, general use of teaching assessment, and actually secondary transition being facilitated, those discussions being easier. And one of the things that made my heart sing, because obviously I didn't incur, I really did sit there as a researcher, they brought up the perceived need for a dyslexia diagnosis being removed. So one said, not having that diagnosis and being able to pick out the children who you know are having difficulties without having to go through hoops. And that supporting conversations with parents, saying you can have an open dialogue with parents. It had become a barrier. We're not in a position to diagnose, and it became an elephant in the room. Now we've kind of ditched that. We're just talking about what the next step is and what we're going to do. So just my last slide that I want to finish on is coming back to the children at the heart of this, because sometimes I think the idea that we're moving away from an individual diagnosis model to a framework means that we're forgetting the children at the heart of it, but that's absolutely not the case. This is about children, and coming back to that point I made right at the beginning about stigma and literacy. What we wanted to do in this school was to think about how we can destigmatize literacy difficulties, to kind of just really be open about the fact that lots of people struggle with literacy, and there's lots of things people can do to help, and just to normalize it. So some of our amazing trainees did some focus groups with children, and these are some of the things that they said. I really hope this works.
When I read out loud, I get confused with words. They get muddled up and it's really easy.
Did you hear that? Is anyone able to let me know? Oh, sorry. Oh, God. Oh, no, it's all gone wrong.
Feels like climbing a mountain.
Oh, God. Oh, no. Right. Oh, no. Right, this presentation's gone wrong. Oh, here we go. So just to end on, I hope that was helpful, and I hope it's given you hope, and I hope it's given you some enthusiasm about literacy that you might be able to take forward into your work. Okay, thanks very much.